All right, let's go ahead and get this community discussion started. This is our seventh community discussion in this series. We've been doing this for about 3 years now. Thank you all for joining us today. As I noted a little earlier, this model is intended to be an opportunity for the community to come together, talk about tough issues at the intersection of accessibility and XR technology. We'll spend the first 20 to 30 minutes with our featured speakers and then use the remainder of the time for an open discussion about the topic at hand, which is, as you all know, AI glasses, empowering disability and reshaping privacy. So as these new technologies are coming onto the market or on the market, and how they're impacting accessibility, as well as then the challenges with privacy that come along and changes in behaviors. So just a few housekeeping rules I'd want to let you know. We are going to have basically an open mic setting here. So this is a meeting. While the calendar invite said an hour, we are planning to go until 2:30. So if you can stay on, that's great. If not, we totally understand, but it is intended to be a 90-minute first presentation and then an hour-long discussion. So with that in mind, please note that if you're not speaking, you need to stay muted. We will be publishing a short readout after this, as well as recording this and publishing it on YouTube, as the rest of our community discussions are published on YouTube. So we want you all to be aware of that. When we do get to the discussion part, and I will say this again, please, when you do add in, and we really want you to speak up, please make sure that you introduce yourself as well. That's really helpful for the whole community. Um, and with that in mind, I'm going to introduce myself and then set the scene and then give a brief introduction to our two speakers. So I am Stephanie Montgomery. I'm the Senior Vice President of Research and Practices here at XRA. I've been here for about 5 years now, working on developing an accessibility program as well as best practice guides for the XR industry and developers, research and infographics to help elevate XR technology for everyone. So that's a little bit about me. Joining me today, and I'm so pleased to have them here, is Andrew Eiche, Chief Executive Owl of Alchemy Labs, and Avi Bar-Zeev, the President of XR Guild and Reality Prime. So thank you both for joining me today for this fun discussion. Um, just to set the scene a little bit, back in November, we talked about privacy at the macro level, and we talked about kids and policy, a little bit about eye tracking, hazards of research. We're going to deep dive into that a little more today. I believe Avi's going to talk maybe a little bit about that. But we really want to focus today not on that broader macro picture of all immersive, but into the lens of these smart glasses that are coming out. We have multiple devices on the market already, from XReal and Meta smart glasses, and we have a lot of glasses that are coming at AWE. Just in June, we saw Spectacles launch their new product, which is basically a full computer and a sunglass on your face, right? So as this technology, we know it's already impacting this community as it becomes more and more ubiquitous. What are the things we need to be careful of? What does the future look like for accessibility for these devices and for humanity as a whole? One of the things we talk about here is putting the human first. How do we make sure that the human is first as we use these devices going forward? So Andrew's gonna speak first and then Avi. So Andrew, if you're invited to please take it away.
Thank you so much. Yeah. I'm going to speak a little bit, and let me share my screen here. I'm going to speak a little bit on more of kind of the practical elements. Here, let's see if this works. Zoop. Did that work? Can you see
Yep.
my whole presentation? Great.
Yep.
I speak more on kind of some practical elements that Alchemy uses, and a little bit less on the external facing, and more like when you're building an experience with these glasses, how can you make it accessible? The reason for that is I think that we all can envision how glasses can actually help when it like interfaces with the world or seeing the world or having that kind of GPS data, those things. But we also need to make sure that the experiences we build on the glasses themselves are accessible. So, for those of you who don't know Alchemy Labs, we made a game called Job Simulator. We made Rick and Morty Virtual Reality, Vacation Simulator, Cosmonius High, and our most recent game is the multiplayer Dimensional Double Shift. It's free. You should go download it. There's a lot of players. They have a lot of fun doing that. And I want to talk a little bit about just some accessibility. And these are just kind of some highlights. I only have a short amount of time. I could probably do hours on this talk, on this topic, but just some things that we do so you can keep them in the back of your mind as you're making your experiences, right? And all of these are in VR. And I know that it's a lot of because a lot of our technology is in VR, but a lot of it translates. We are doing work on um, on these kind of pass-through headsets. Google is releasing Project Aura, and that's like a big pass-through headset thing. So as you're doing that kind of work, many of the same rules apply. And so one of the big things we do is physicality, right? And that's a big differentiator between us and kind of the standard way of developing interfaces. I think it's very easy to go, oh, well, what's our proxy for a click? How do we do a click in VR? And that isn't really even accessible to like people who don't have any disabilities, let alone people who have disabilities, right? So you can see we have these buttons and they're very much using the self haptic and the touch, but also the physicality. It lets the button come to you. It lets you, you can see the button like jump into your hand and you pinch it. And that physicality uh, creates a lot of like parallels with the real world and creates a lot of intrinsic mental knowledge about how the space is going to work and how it's going to interact. And it lowers the cognitive hurdle. And from there, we can have an excellent base to build accessible experiences. So there you actually see one of our accessible things where if you hold your finger up, this is a dialogue that appears when you hold your hand up and you look at it. But if you only have one hand, that's a problem. So you hold your finger up, it pins it, and then that lets you pinch the button. Another thing that I frequently see people not necessarily thinking with the best design principles is windows, right? So very common experience. You need to have essentially a pane of something that shows data, right? Because we have 2D in our lives since the invention of writing. We've been writing on 2D surfaces. And so we need to take a 2D surface, put it in the virtual world, and show data on it. And it's very common to want to control that space and to want to try to bound the user to make sure it looks pretty in screenshots, or the user can't be trusted because they'll put something in an ugly or awful space. And we reject that notion. We don't believe that clean design is necessarily accessible design. So with our windows, we actually give control back to the users completely. So like some windowing systems, right? Meta's operating system, for instance, as you pull the window back and forward, it does all these automatic things. But if you want to put it at a specific angle, right? You want it to be close to you, but raised up, but also tilted. It won't do that. And so it's this kind of like configuration that we take pride in and that we work is that allowing that physicality. And I think that's kind of my note as we make these experiences on these glasses, especially since we're going to be making windows in these kind of like pass-through experiences, that you want to make sure, again, you're not confusing clean design with accessible design, right? That kind of user options are so important. They can also resize the windows themselves. They get to pick the size, they get to pick where it's placed, and they get to pick how they interact with it and touch it. Another big thing is environmental objects. As you design pass-through experiences, specifically, um, objects in pass-through tend to be very detailed, small number of objects, whereas in VR you have lots of less detailed objects. And so in this particular case, we work really hard to make sure there's a comfortable space for everyone. So if you look at the top screenshot, you'll see there's a big handle on that desk, and all surfaces in the game are manually adjustable with handles to make sure you have the right ergonomic space. You can pick up everything or drop everything. Every desk can be a standing desk. Every desk can be a sitting desk. And most desks can be laying on the floor desks if that's really what you want to do. Um, we also adjust floor heights and a social experience to make sure that no one is looking down on anyone, right? A common thing that you get in accessible experiences is, right, like, oh, somebody is choosing to sit in a chair or somebody has to sit in a chair, right? That's just they physically cannot be standing up. And you have somebody else standing up and you get this social like looking down on them. And so what you see is kind of those pizza wedge shapes in the bottom, and you see a floor raising up. And what it does is it means that you're the correct height from your head to the floor, but the floor level is changed to make sure that everyone is at approximately eye level. So everyone is even and looking at each other. We allow players to scale themselves too. In that first image, they're actually changing their scale, and that just lets them reach a little further and grab things. It just changes their scale. So they don't have to lean as much or bend as much around things. I think these are all the things that you have to think about, right? It's easy to say, okay, we're going to make an accessible experience in these glasses because you're walking around down the street. And it's like, there's a lot of assumptions that get you to the user is able to walk down the street. And so just make sure that as you're building up that chain, you have like you've accounted for each route and you've worked with that community. You've accounted for each route. And the other thing I'll say about a lot of this before I move on is we test with folks from the disability community, and we are like very conscious of how we work with that group. So we're not just making these things and going like, you're welcome. It's like we make them, we give them to organizations that help us test. We work with these testers directly, never about us without us is kind of the phrase that you hear, and just make sure that you're doing that because it's very easy to go, oh yeah, see, we figured it out, this works for you, and be like, actually it doesn't, right? So all of this is extensively tested too. One of the biggest things that we talk about is captions. Alchemy developed an XR native caption system. I think this is really important because when you start talking about the glasses, we're going to start hearing about captions, right? And one of the places where we've done a really good job of captioning is in XR. And so you want to look at the VR games and how they do it, because the VR games could be a model for how you would do it in a pass-through experience with human voices, right? And so we do lots of different things in our captions. One of them is we spatially guide the player to the location of the speaker. So we leave an arrow up that points to where the voice is coming from. So that way, somebody who's talking behind you, you don't miss the caption because you're not looking at them, but you also don't assume they're in front of you. It pulls you towards the voice. We smartly move the captions around what we think key objects are to make sure that you're not missing something, they're not in front of you. We use some really creative shading techniques so the captions appear physically in the space. They're not always on top. They're like somewhere in the space, but you don't lose their visibility. And that also helps prevent nausea, right? Having a thing strapped to poke to your head is not really that great for nausea, because your brain will start to go, wow, something isn't moving, but the rest of the environment is. I must be poisoned. And you don't want that. And so XRA actually published an entire accessibility guide, and captions were part of it. Meta's published accessibility standards. Many others have published accessibility standards. A lot of that was influenced by us in some way because we did these captions and talked about them and worked really closely with these folks. So you should see those guidelines. You should follow those guidelines. And as we're thinking about how to extend that beyond characters where we know what they're saying and characters that aren't in a virtual space but are in our real world, we could take inspiration in like wholly steal from these kind of things and be like, oh, okay, cool. We can guide folks around to a speaker and show them who's speaking and work from that standpoint. Um, and on that note, speaking of our known universes, is one of the cool things we did that is going to play really well for the AI glasses side is in our game Cosmonius High, we made a catalog of every single thing in the world, and we provide an audio description and a detailed description for everything in the world, and a bunch of other low visibility things like focusing the player's attention on certain stuff, highlighting hard to see objects, giving deeper details, moving, getting players to see key items. And the thing is, like, when we made this, right, we kind of thought that glasses could do this, but now the AI glasses, depending on whether you have a display or not, right? Without a display, you could probably do the audio descriptions, but with a display, we're talking about like, okay, you have some really interesting things you could do with computer vision and with these AI models to really understand what's in the world and get, people to highlight objects, to get people to see objects, to get people to get details on them and then get deeper details. And so, games are a cool, like, simulated environment for us to mess around with that. Like, kind of my last thing, I want to give you a preview of something we're working on that I think is really cool. It's not out yet, but one of the things we're working on is a caption log, which the best way to describe it is it's like a meeting notes like you see in Zoom or in Google Meet. but built for XR and without the need for an additional app, right? You don't need Google Docs to read this. And so basically in XR, we don't chat, right? There's no chat log. You can't just type away and scroll back in chat log because we're all talking with our voices, right? And typing is cumbersome in XR. So we are building this like deep caption log that combines what the players are saying because we're obviously building captions, as you can see by this aptly named person, first name, last name, anonymous human. But that person, we're using AI to get their voice and to do, you know, speech to text, and then we're also taking the environmental captions and we're combining them in like one unified log, which is so we get, you know, kind of all parts, which is really great. It's just one of those things too, right? If a lot of data is flying by you, you may need the caption log to be like, oh, what did he just say? I just missed it. And instead of being like, hey, can you repeat? Hey, can you repeat? Or can you talk slower? Or those kind of things. It gives you an additional surface to say, okay, I want to actually like read this. And as you can see, we have all the lovely other options like changing the font size and changing the caption log size and all those other things. But this is still in development. We don't have a release date yet for it, but it is something we are thinking about. And so with that, thank you. This was my like designing accessible experiences and some best practices. There's a ton more information out there. You should definitely go read the XRA's guide as well as other accessibility guides. But don't just try to make the experience accessible on the external facing side. Also think about how your users are interfacing with it internally.
Awesome. Thank you, Andrew. I know that was a lot to stick into just a short time frame, and I already have a few questions for you coming out of that, so we'll take them on the back end. But now I wanted to introduce Avi, and Avi, welcome. As I presented at the top of the hour, Avi is the president of the XR Guild and the Reality Prime Consulting Company. And Avi, you have some interesting stuff to share with us, having been at the forefront of this for a long time.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. That was a great talk by Andrew. And I'm I'm gonna tout one more set of guidelines that you can take a look at, which is I'll tell you at the end of telling you what I've worked on. So for background on me, I'll go fast through this slide, but I've worked on a whole bunch of really fun things over the years, including Google Earth before it was Google Earth, and we even used the term spatial computing all the way back in 1992. So I'm really happy that that's a term that people are picking up now. It takes a while, but it's a great term for what we're doing. And the UX guidelines that I wanted to tout here are Apple's actually, and because Apple has all this advanced hardware sitting on your head in the Vision Pro, there are a whole bunch of privacy issues that come up and accessibility issues that come up. And I think Apple's done a really good job of tackling those. So you can check out from the human interface group at Apple, the design guidelines include a lot of accessibility guidelines. And just as an example, there was somebody on my team early on, and we did early prototyping. We didn't do any of the final UX, but we did a lot of early prototyping. But somebody on my team had a divergent angle between his eyes. And we wanted to push eye tracking. That was a big deal for us, but it wouldn't work for him because his eyes were not aligned the way a lot of people's are. And so one of the features you'll see in the Vision Pro and other devices is the ability to pick one eye or the other to do eye tracking. And so you discover these things sometimes as you're doing them and you realize that's something we absolutely have to have. But if you don't even have the ability to use your eyes for eye tracking, there are all sorts of other ways, alternate mechanisms that you can use. So even though there might be one prime path, there are always other approaches that you can take to try to use the device in a ways you can. It's not perfect. There's going to always be a case where somebody can't do what they might want to do. But I think Apple's done a good job of trying to be as appropriate to as many people as they can be, not just catering to the 80%, but to getting to the 99% of everybody if they can. So moving on, the question I think that comes up for us today is you have all these good intentions. You want to build accessibility into your product, but what compromises do you have to make in order to make that happen? Do you have to, for example, run your cameras and send all the imagery up to some server because your computer vision's happening in the cloud? Do you have to run the microphones all the time to be able to caption, as Andrew was talking about? If you want to do all the captioning of what people have been saying, there's a privacy implication with wearing all day wearable glasses, and that you could be recording everybody potentially without consent. And the argument that I'm going to make is that the accessibility and privacy are actually intrinsically aligned once you understand the problem. There's not as much of a conflict as it might seem if you are truly catering to both needs at the same time. And the thesis is that basically the more we care about helping people with uncommon needs, people who might be at the tail of the normal distribution in terms of their ability to use technology in various ways, the more we care about doing that, the more we have to listen to them. And Andrew made the same point that you can't just say that you know what to do. You have to listen to them and include them in the design process in order to understand how they experience the world and how it might be different from our own experiences. But if we care about that, then we should also care about protecting the privacy for them as well as everybody else around them. That's the first step. Caring about doing the right thing will lead us to think about what the right thing is, and hopefully we can actually achieve it. And the rest of my talk is going to be mostly about how to achieve it, but also where it's gone wrong. So, not to pick on one company, but I think that, I would start calling some of these early attempts not glass holes, but maybe peepholes, because it's essentially like walking around with a hole in the wall on your head that somebody else can look through. And we've seen this come up in terms of one company, being sued for privacy concerns because workers in Kenya were reviewing very, very private footage of people being naked or having sex. It's not clear how those things were recorded. I can't really imagine somebody saying, "Hey, Meta," during sex. So it's possible, but most likely the glasses are recording on their own. And that's concerning as well if you don't even know it's happening. I would argue that consent has to be knowing. I mean, there's this, in research, there's this idea of informed consent. That means the person not only knows something's happening, they understand why it's happening, they can say no, they can understand how the data is being used. And I think we could safely say that in a lot of these cases that click wrap EULA is not appropriate consent. Even a checkbox in a UI buried somewhere is not appropriate consent. We really need to make sure people understand. And the case in the upper right is a good example of where a man thought it was fine to use his glasses on a subway to record a woman he thought was attractive. She didn't appreciate it, and she came up and broke his glasses. And then he put her picture up on the internet to try to find her to get his money back. So, double bad. And that's just not appropriate. And we have to be cautious of this. And, we could argue about public versus private. I would say a subway is a constrained place. Everybody has to be together for a certain amount of time. You want to be respectful and treat it like a private place, not a place that people can get away from you if they don't like what you're doing very easily. Also, I think some of the answers in terms of simply blurring the faces of people who might be captured nude doesn't really make it private, especially when it's in their own home. There's going to be all sorts of identifying things in their home, such as pictures on the wall, their names. I have my name on my desk here. Like, that's not considered privacy simply to blur a face. So I'm going to talk about some better ways to handle this. But where we're concerned is what comes up next is features that we expect to see in the future are to add eye tracking. The Apple Vision Pro has eye tracking. The Meta Quest Pro had eye tracking on it. And other all-day wearable glasses coming on the market do have eye tracking. And if you want to know more about that, the QR code in the lower right takes you to a 20-minute talk I gave at Stanford a couple of years ago that deep dives into this one issue of eye tracking, and it's actually super fascinating. So I would encourage you to watch that talk. I'm not going to take up any more time here. But one of the features that's been talked about is this idea of Face ID, which has been maybe called name tag. I would say I like the feature. Actually, I think it's a very important feature for people who might have low vision or other means to be able to identify who they're talking to. There's a lot of good reasons to do it, but there's a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it. I'm going to try to tease out the difference. By the way, on the eye tracking, see the eye moving around so quickly? That's one of the fascinating things that goes to why eye tracking could be like mind reading, is the fact that our eyes naturally move around all the time and give a very good hint as to what we're focusing on. So information like eye tracking and other biometric sense data, as well as voice and things like that, The most important thing is that what's collected on a device stays on a device. You can call it the Vegas rules of data collection is don't send it to the cloud unless we're absolutely sure that it's not going to be used for other purposes other than what a person has agreed to explicitly. Apple has come up with a way that they call a private cloud that keeps the data encrypted and processed in an encrypted way, so even Apple engineers can't look at it, and certainly not being shipped off to Kenya. And that's important even if you are going to use the cloud. But ideally, you can do everything on a device, even though that might require more compute and more power. If you can keep the data on the device, that's going to be better for privacy. And the processing is better locally because it's going to be faster and all sorts of things. Now, the name tag feature, I just wanted to spend one more second on because there was this quote that came out that is concerning that they might try to launch this when we're not looking. And the way it might get launched is as a benefit. This comes up for accessibility because a lot of these accessibility features are sold to us as we're doing this as a public benefit. But in this case, the public benefit may be you should be able to know if you're talking to a creep. So you're going to get this information on your glasses that's going to tell you the person you're talking to is not trustworthy. That's how they'll sell it probably, or as an accessibility feature. But what the reality is a feature like that could be used against everybody else who doesn't want that information being seen by the creep who might be using it to figure out how to talk to you in order to sweet talk you into whatever they want. So we have to be very, very careful of the dual use of all these technologies for us or against us and prevent the bad ways from happening. So here's a little bit more about consent. So let's just imagine we have a pair of glasses that has a light on them, that the light is intended to be a warning that the glasses are recording so that people in the vicinity can move away. So our child in this case has decided he doesn't want to be photographed and he's moved away. Consent around children is a very complicated subject. In general, only their parents can give consent for them to be recorded. But in this case, the child was smart enough to move away. But what happens when everybody has glasses? Where do you go? Where in the world is it safe to stand if anybody can be recording you at any given time? So I would argue that notice is not sufficient anymore once there are enough glasses in the world, and we absolutely have to move to a model of consent. And even consent is not enough, but it's a good starting place. So here's a proposal to think about for how we might be able to obtain consent. So the first thing is, let's take the question of Face ID as a useful feature, but one that has these potential issues associated with it. So first thing is that your smart device should only be able to Face ID people who have given you consent. And the next slide, we'll talk about how to obtain that cleanly. The second idea is that your device can only process what they consented to. So if they told you their name and their profile, you have access to that. It'd be super useful for remembering things like their name, the pronunciation of their name, the birth date, their family. I like to call this the Gary app. If you've ever seen the show Veep, Gary is the person who stands behind the vice president whispering in her ears all the things that she forgot about all the people that she might be speaking to. It's a very useful feature, and we can do it, but only when we've obtained that data via consent. So if somebody told you their birthday, you can remember it, but it's a little bit creepy if you go look it up and tell them things that they didn't tell you. So it's more pro-social when you only stick to what's been consented. But you can also include the machine translation, the interpretation, the other assistive tech that we've been talking about, and more, if there is consent. The nice thing about this model is that when you take photographs or other recordings, only the consenting people will show up. And as usual, that's what you'd expect to happen. But the non-consenting people can be removed. They can be made unidentifiable because we don't have their consent. So let's talk about how to do that. And I would invite people to think about any counterexamples that break this model, because I think this works just about everywhere. But if you have ones, please tell me in the questions. So imagine a bunch of ways that we presently give consent. One is bumping phones, sharing contact information. So we can basically share our email or our phone number with other people just by touching our phones together. We could imagine similar ways for the glasses for that to work. It could be one way to do it, not the only way, could be special hand gestures. And this would require designers to think about all the different hand gestures around the world that people use that have social meaning and to find one that's neutral, that doesn't mean something else. You certainly wouldn't want to encourage people to be giving a rude gesture. But something where if you were to photograph the people doing this gesture would provide consent. And this is in addition to potentially bumping phones or other things. QR codes are a great fallback. If you show a code on your phone, the camera, assuming you still have a phone, and you will for a while, can take a picture of that. The glasses don't have an outward-facing display, but we can also think of ways, something that light could be useful for is actually flashing a pattern that could provide consent. So the sequence of flashes of light could be read by the camera on another pair of glasses in order to communicate consent information. But even if we have to give verbal consent, we could imagine saying something and using all this great AI to be able to understand whether or not people gave consent and also read some of the terms to make sure people understand how it's going to be used before they do. So is it clunkier than just walking up and taking a picture? Absolutely. But is it pro-social, and is it something that people would appreciate giving their consent for these situations? Yes. And I think that we can make all of these cases work with accessibility in mind. It's just going to take a lot of creativity to figure out all the different fallbacks for all the devices and the different modes of communication that people might have. One of the bystander benefits, though, and this is important because we live in this world where currently we think this third-party doctrine that the Supreme Court supports the idea that if you just take a picture in public, then it's fair game. Everybody can be photographed in public, right? Because how would you possibly obtain all their consent? Well, the reality is the third-party doctrine doesn't really apply to just simply being in public. It's mostly about the information you give your bank. Can they keep the information, use the information? But we do apply it to being in public. But anything in public is not fair game. And that a good example of where it's not fair game is if you're filming a movie, you need to get releases from all the people who show up in the background of your movie, the extras. They're either paid or they at least have to give their consent because it's a commercial venture. And in the case of Street View, you might think it's fine for these cars to drive around and take pictures of the street, but in Germany, that was ruled not illegal. And as a result, Google blurred all the faces of all the people in the street. And in this case, I think blurring the faces is probably sufficient because they're not in their homes. We can't really identify them too much. Maybe tattoos, another question we want to do. But in general, it would be better to just remove the people from Street View. We don't need to see the people. It's only about the street and about the roads. So why don't we just actually use generative AI to just erase the people and they're not needed. But in the case of photographs, say the examples on the bottom, you're taking some pictures in a restaurant. These are the people at the table who've probably given you consent. They're going to be okay. I'd love you to take my picture. But if one of them wasn't going to give you consent, we could figure out a way to blur her face, remove it, and to make sure that this photograph was safe to share. I don't really care if the original photograph with her face on it stays on your phone or your glasses, but when you share it out is when we want to be concerned about removing the identifiable features from people, their voice, their face. But if they give consent after the fact, that's fine. Put them back in. If you have the original, you can always reprocess it and they can now show up. But the people in the background, the next table, one thing I noticed about trying to find art to use for this slide was you can't even find pictures of people in restaurants when there's people in the background because any professionally photographed photo actually removes the people. They don't put people there. So they already know about this problem. So the challenge that I would say is think of any case where it's not possible to obtain consent for the purposes of accessible technology, for transcriptions or describing what's seen in the image or any of the things, including enhancing photographs, and assume for the future that the no consent default is to de-identify the people who have any consent and only include the people who have. And if we do that, I think we're going to be in a much better world. So that's my presentation. Happy to answer questions.
Excellent. Thank you both. I see some hands clapping. Uh, um, I did, Avi, to just talk a little about that. The transcription came to mind where you just mentioned it, and Andrew, you had mentioned that captioning, which led me straight to like if you have the glasses on and you have a transcription that you can go back to, then what does that kind of mean for privacy, right? So if either of you want to just talk about that for a minute, thinking about that through in the real world, using those glasses to do that kind of captioning and transcription, which would be really useful in a lot of different contexts, right?
Yeah, I'll just do a quick one. I'll let Andrew give the longer answer because he's been working on that more. But the quick one is if you just following up on the consent idea, if somebody didn't consent to transcription, we could imagine ways to anonymize what they're saying. Don't include their name, or we don't include any of the information, or we can filter the information. So identifying things like if they say their name accidentally or other information comes through, we might be able to remove some of those bits. But the goal would be de-identification unless they've explicitly opted in. And then I'll just say that, and then Andrew can talk about the complexities.
Oh, I was gonna say, like, even for this call, you all actually consented to transcription when you joined the call. So there's obvious gates. I think for some of the kind of transcription, it depends on how much fusion you're doing, right? There's a world where transcription is just whatever words the device hears in a conversational respect are presented back to you in an anonymized format. And unless somebody like like looks right into the glasses and goes, I am Andrew Eiche and this is my transcription, it's going to be anonymized by default. It's only when you start like pairing things with like facial recognition and you go, okay, we're going to dig you out of a database and we're going to do this, that you end up in these real spots. And then we're already actually facing this problem. That's what I was really going to say, is that we already live in like the weird global panopticon where the second anything happens, the phones all come out and there's video. So transcription to me is just an extent of that. And whatever we think about for everybody takes video of everything all the time is going to have to also be addressed with transcription.
Yeah, just as a quick, if people don't remember, AOL had published their search logs 10, 15, 20 years ago. And there was a big controversy because they thought they had anonymized it by stripping out all the names and tried to depersonalize it. But given enough information, people can conflate and correlate different pieces of information to try to reconstruct. And they were able to reconstruct the identity of a lot of those so-called anonymous search logs. So a lot of this has to be a collaborative effort to try to minimize the amount of data we collect and simplify and not just automatically share everything out, which is why I was saying on the consent side, I don't really care if you have the original photo, if it's a photo, or the original recording. But when we share these out publicly is when we need to scrub them for that extra identifying information that could be built up by connecting them to other pieces of information, like a previous recording of your voice with your name attached. Doesn't help if you're anonymized if it's the same voice. So it might even include, if a recording were getting uploaded to the cloud, it might even include voice shifting technology or only uploading a transcript that could be scrubbed down to just the text and removing those names, like Andrew said.
So then let's go back, Avi, to that like name tag example that we were using, right? The one that we would all love to have if we don't remember names and faces of people. Um, if it's just for private use, then is it okay that we would use our AI glasses? That would be scraping the internet supposedly to find data on someone standing in front of you? Is it just then the application of how much you share, making it too creepy or not creepy? Does that become a norms and behaviors issue?
Yeah, it's
What
very
do you think?
complicated, but let me give you I'm going to give you an extreme example of why the idea that if I just do it privately on my glasses and nobody ever sees it, it doesn't hurt anybody. So let's imagine we've heard of these deep fake nudes, all right? And sorry for anybody, this is sort of content warning here, that this could be a little touchy, but um, if if somebody sees you and they're able to use an AI
820.
that can virtually unclothe you, then on their glasses, they're the only ones that see you nude. But are you okay with that? I don't think most people would be okay with a private function of people sending your current live photographs out to deep fake to see you nude, even potentially even superimposed on your body. As even not today, you can only do it in a photo, but
Mm.
I think we want to be super careful about how we do this. And so that when I say consent, I mean the consent to record. And so even if you're only going to look at the information privately, I think that we want to be very careful about assuming people have consented just because they're in a situation where we might be able to photograph them without getting in trouble. Integrating all this data and putting it together and looking up their birthday and looking up who they're dating and their profile, their relationship status, and all these other things gets really creepy really fast. There's a really good video done by some people I know called Sight, and Sight Extended was a longer version of it. I'd encourage people to look that up. It was imagining a future of AI of AR glasses that had AI in them, where the protagonist is doing incredibly offensive, creepy things to his dates, and she doesn't know, but it's still wrong. And so I think we want to say early on, upfront, let's only do the scenarios that can be provably done with consent. And if somebody, if I consent to share my birthday and my relationship status with you, now you know it. Until I revoke that, you know it, and you can look it up. So you get the Gary app, you get it. You get the things we want from this extended memory, but we can do it in a way that's socially acceptable and not exploiting people.
Yeah, Yeah, we absolutely shouldn't exploit people. Hello, Darling movie came to mind. But is there is there a bar that people would consider would be like public information, right? Things that they would put on LinkedIn, not birthdays, et cetera, or is everything off the table and must have consent? Like where would we fall on that spectrum as a group, do we think?
Um, I don't know, Andrew, do you want to go first on that one? Okay, I have an answer.
I think there is some expectation of public space. Like we've established in the law. It just depends on what database you're pulling. Like it's nuanced, right? This is what is what the whole thing seems to
Right.
be, right? Which is
Hmm.
if you're standing in a public square, right? We have already established as a society, if you're on the side of a street in the United States, not in Germany, but in the United States, right? You can film and there's not a reasonable expectation of privacy. The question is that was established when you couldn't, that whole law was created when we couldn't, like then look up your face instantly. You need somebody to recognize you. So I think we're just going to have to confront a lot of these, like, okay, it's not just a picture anymore. It's actually like a synthetic form of ID. And what does that mean? And how far are we willing to go? Whereas before it was like, oh, if you're in a public space, you could just drop a microphone or drop a video camera and that's fine.
So I would encourage people to think of this as the way that we think of our homes. We don't think of our homes as public, but we have areas of our homes that are fine for entertaining people, right? Our living rooms are pretty generally sanitary. Like it's okay to invite people over, and these are the things that we agree to share. The outside of our homes, might put up holiday lights. We might put up political signs on the outside of our house. These are the things that we've chosen to share with other people on the outside of the house and maybe even in the early parts of the inside. But our bedrooms are different. Our bedrooms are considered much more private. And so there's these different layers of privacy that we've all established around physical spaces as well. And then there's out in public where we walk around. I would argue that wearing these smart glasses is very much like like a turtle shell. It's like wearing your house on your body, in that there are going to be things about us that we will wear on the outside. So think of that as if there's an invisible skin, a digital skin, there's things on the outside of the skin that we want the world to see that we publish. There's things that are just inside that we might share with people that we trust, that we might invite into our house. And there's stuff way inside that we don't publish unless you're an intimate friend. And we want to have those levels of control of what's outside, what's superficially available, and then what's inside. And that's true wherever we go. So now this distinction of being out in public or at home goes away because we're wearing the technology on our body, again, like this digital skin. And it shouldn't matter where we are. The expectation of privacy now shifts to my personal stuff is expected to be private, even if I'm standing on a street corner, because nobody should have a right to inspect that data unless I've given them permission. But if I'm wearing a tattoo or a hat or a political sign and carrying it around or a button, that's public and people can see it. So that should be up to the individual adult to be able to decide where they draw those lines, I think.
So along those lines of how you present to people, right?
Exactly. Exactly. We don't want to restrict
Um,
how people
I
present, and
I just
that's when
yeah,
we
I
get into
just wanted
trouble.
right. Yep. Yep. I just wanted to open it up to everyone. You can always put your question in the chat if you have a question. I've seen some traffic coming back and forth here. If you can see that. I did want to say that we are planning to go on to 2:30. So please feel free to weigh in. If you have anything you wanted to add, you can talk about what what we've been sharing here, or if you have something to add to the conversation or consideration. I see a lot of names I know here that I know have opinions in this space. So please feel free to share them with the group and we can talk about them. Um, so just looking, I mean, we did some prep questions before, right? Let's talk about a little more about the future and what the future looks like if we do have these glasses with on a lot of people, and the glasses are more compute. We had that technology kind of transformation as we talked about with mobile phones, right? We couldn't all walk around with these computers in our hands before. What does that look like when it's even less, there's less friction, so it's less visible what's going on? And then a little bit about the accessibility affordances here, right? So how are these, now it's on your face is one less thing to carry. How is that more useful for people who can really use this tool to be more, I'm trying to think like autonomous in their day, right? So they can more easily get from place to place. And Andrew, to your point about the additional text, right? I was trying to use that earlier when I was in San Francisco looking at a piece of art, that alt text that's on an object. And it wasn't even there yet to tell me this is a piece of art I'm looking at, right? It was just, here's some sheep under a tree. And I was like, this is a famous place. How do we kind of like move into that space where you can find out about things like art that's in public spaces more easily, right?
I
Any
mean,
thoughts?
some of this is like the concept of world model and understanding the world and digital twin and that. I mean, there's a whole field of technology, right? Um, in many ways, the device is already here, and many of you actually already wear it on a daily basis. It's AirPods. The only difference between an AirPod and a meta set of glasses is the cameras, and the cameras honestly are not providing that much extra. They will eventually be like, "What am I looking at?" But you could pick up your phone and be like, what am I looking at?" So it's like the technology is already there. You could do directions completely on your AirPods, on your headphones, and have it tell you, walk this way, walk that way. So that's why it's like that to me is not the transformative technology, isn't the meta glasses unless you're like a creep, right? That's where those non-display. It's when you add the display that it
Hey,
gets really interesting. And that's where you start getting things like captions and you start getting highlighting objects in the world and pointing things out. And that's where the AI part, which is, kind of where we went back to. Why are these AI glasses? Why is this something different that we've never had before? And it's really the connection to these like large language models, right? These incredibly powerful, uh, somewhat hallucinatory models that can give us context and have massive amounts of data to rely on and can provide some level of inference. And so it's really like, how do we get to knowing that that's a painting, connecting it to the model, right? And there's some that have done that. I know the Samsung headsets are starting to do that, right? And the Google, the Android XR as part of that. That you could do like circle in the air and be like, what am I looking at? And you can, even in an experience, you'd be like, what am I looking at? And it'll try to look it up on YouTube. And so it's as the fidelity of that increases, you're gonna find out that the alt text has always been there. It's really like trained on a Wikipedia entry, trained on all that. And then really the question is going to be a usability question. How do we surface that? How do we make it usable? And how do we understand? It's very easy for us to understand what am I looking at when there's one subject and it's a painting, but you might be on a street corner and be like, what am I looking at? Right. And you might actually be asking, what am I looking at? Where am I? Can you please tell me what intersection I'm at? And it might be like, in the background is this church. And you're like, I don't want a tour guide. I just want to know where I am. So it's this context it's a context that's going to be interesting to me and those kind of things. But as far as like the actual tech that enables it, we're very much already there. And the difference is phone in pocket versus phone not. And then the display is going to be what really adds kind of a new layer that we are not seeing on a day-to-day basis. But there's the only thing the glasses let you do right now that a phone can't do is be discreet.
Those are, I think,
right,
really good points.
right. Well, it
I
just gives
think
you hands. Right.
let
Yeah.
me give you some audio only examples, so just to sort of bring some of this back to the near term, because not everybody has display glasses yet, and they're not yet as sleek as we might like. Um, but to your point first, Andrew, about picking what it is that you care about, that's incredibly important. And everybody has to go through this journey separately, I guess. It's hard to explain, but the thought experiment is, you could imagine a camera on your face that sees the world and it's telling you the thing in the center of your view. But as Andrew was saying, now there's 15 things in your view, and you don't want it to tell you all of those things. Eye tracking, again, back to that topic that I mostly skipped, can tell you
Mhm.
what somebody cares about. That's one of the magic tricks that you can do with eye tracking is the thing that you're looking at is most likely the thing you just looked at before you even said anything is most likely the thing you care about. And so you actually would want to record that eye tracking information, but it reveals so much that it's very, very sensitive. But with audio only and cameras and potentially eye tracking, you could do a much better job of telling people what is the thing they're looking at that they care about, and also discerning whether they are just casually looking in that direction or actually care about it. There's an intent there. But again, it's almost like mind reading. It can start to determine which products you like and what you might be inclined to buy. And that's why some of the companies are very interested in this, because there's a lot of advertising intent in that information. But now let's imagine somebody who might have low vision who's receiving audio navigation. These things already exist, but imagine a better way to do it. If you had spatial audio in the glasses, the spatial audio allows you to place the sounds in the world very precisely if they're calibrated well to the shape of your head and the shape of your ears. It all matters. Um, you could imagine leading somebody by sound instead of simply saying turn right, because turn right where? If I don't know exactly what you mean when the computer says turn right, I could be turning right in the wrong place, or I could be turning right into a wall. I could be turning right into a street. And so what you'd really like to be able to do is to follow the sound of my voice, follow the sound of some cue in the world. And that could be done with a combination of computer vision and spatial audio, where we could very precisely, essentially grab you by the elbow and carry you through the world to the place that you really wanted to go. And that can become a much more meaningful and safe way to transit something if you don't have the same level of vision that other people have. So there's some things that could be done today. Well, if not all devices have really good spatial audio. Wearing these AirPods, these have really good spatial audio because Apple's invested a lot. But just wearing a pair of glasses might not give you quite the same experience yet. And there's all the competing sounds in the world to contend with. But if you take that experiment even further and the world starts getting polluted with layers and layers and layers of information, we're going to need that same kind of filtering and intent filtering that a search engine provides, right? If a search engine just started blasting you with every possible thing, it wouldn't be very useful. It has to focus in on what do you really want and need. And even the Gary app that I've talked about could be really annoying if it started randomly spouting things that you didn't need to know. And so
Right.
it needs that kind of editorial layer on top of it that understands you well enough. And eventually, what we get to, not this year, but in a couple of years, is this idea of what I like to call the personal shield AI. But going back to this digital skin, there needs to be some AI that lives near your body that knows you well enough to be able to know what is relevant to you and what are the right pieces of information. But that becomes the AI that's very sacred now, and not the one we want living in the cloud. It's the one we want having our private data, but only on the inside of that boundary, not on the outside, because it knows so much about us, it could be very exploitive if it were used against us.
Right, right. Well, we have some questions in the chat. So the first one was from Laura, and she's just reminding us that people are already adopting smart glasses and cameras, and the tens of millions by the end of this year is predicted. But what is the pathway by which XRA and expert recommendations on privacy are accepted by society and law? Uh, Um, I think that's an amazing question, Laura. We already talked a little bit about how Europe does it differently, right? Uh, Um, I don't know. What are you guys' thoughts on this question?
It seems to be pretty voluntary in the US, and there seems to be this attitude among companies that you should just, because we don't know the right answer, and I'm not sure I agree that we don't know, but they'll say we don't know, we just have to try it and see what happens, and then we'll deal with it and fix it later. And fixing it later causes all sorts of problems in society. So I think it is worth the effort, and I think we do need to have more of a voice in the government. I do agree with not over-regulating things too soon, but I would love to see some of these big companies, especially the ones that already show that they care about privacy, to lead by example and to put these technologies out in a way that other companies realize that the standard has been set, even if the government hasn't enforced it in the US. That one of the large companies says, this is the way we're going to do it. There are a bunch of small companies that are doing it. They just don't have the market reach that the big ones do. So there's a lot of startups for doing glasses that are totally private by design, like Raven. I was very interested in seeing what they're doing, but they're still small. And until you have hundreds of, tens of millions of people, it's hard to sway the way everybody goes. So I really want the big companies to lead on this and to establish those standards, even if the government currently is not willing to.
Excellent. Laura, did you have something to add to your question? I saw you came off mute for a second there.
Yes, I think that was a great answer. I think the other side of it, Avi, is also technology enablement, because some of the solutions that you're talking about do require the implementation of these digital skins and other technological designs that would be designed for privacy. So I think it's part technology and part government, and then also culture. And I think culture might be the hardest part.
And then on springboarding off of that, and Steve, I see you there too, and same thing, I've got your question as well. From that developer side, Andrew, I know when we're designing things, we talk about user interface, user experience, et cetera, thinking about that and what the influence that the developers might have on what they're building and the experiences in these AI glasses, what role they might have to play in this topic of norms and behaviors, right?
I mean, there's two things I have. One is on the law side, is like that's why we have enormous compliance groups and enormous privacy
Yeah.
working groups and stuff like that. So, it's my explicitly like I try not to be the expert on purpose because I work with the folks who I understand their expertise, and like I think presenting a framework for the possible is great, and that's what we're doing here. I think saying like developers have influence is a little bit laughable in that like it's really it's gonna have to come from the platforms, right? And that's what we're kind of doing here is we're saying like Meta at a platform level needs to start thinking about this, right? Because if you just say like, developers, it's on you to be good, but we're not going to stop you from doing this, you're just hoping that like the large swath of humanity is equally committed to ethics as you are. And it's just we don't see that. That's why the to regulatory, right? There's regulatory from the government, but also like Apple has a lot of standards that the government doesn't tell them to do, right? And they're like, "Hey, you have to fit within these. You can't violate these standards." So, I do think that we should be presenting this stuff, but we should also make sure that it's like, sure, I can do it, right? I can be the most privacy conscious developer that's ever lived, and that will not ensure that anyone has privacy because there's a lot of
Mhm.
people who don't care.
That's
Right.
absolutely right.
Well, that's true.
I think though doing it
Um,
right, I'll just add one thing. The benefit of doing it right, even for a small company, is that when the eventual lawsuit happens and the big company who didn't do it right gets hauled into court, you have positive examples of how it could have been done. So they can't argue that nobody knew how to do this. They can't
Ex-
argue that it's a
yeah,
new thing. You'd be like, no,
yeah.
look at how those
It's
guys
like,
did it.
yeah, I guess it's always good to be standing in front of the like charred remains of the building, going like, "Well, I knew we should have put sprinklers in." But yeah, yeah, I mean, you're right there.
That's a good analogy. Yeah.
So another question in the chat is, how do we prevent hackers in all this? And can this be helpful for collaborations with transport systems for visually impaired or blind? I think we hit a little bit on that, but what are your thoughts there?
I can
For
take the hacker
hackers,
one.
like,
Good.
is
Yeah,
this the hackers
hackers.
question? You're like
It's
worried that
hackers. It's two part. It's hackers, and then the technology being helpful for collaboration for transportation and visually
it
impaired,
depends on what the
right?
hackers want, right? Just sending people on loops is not necessarily useful. How do we prevent hackers? Is a lot of the same ways that we prevent hackers in the current world, right? There's you, best cybersecurity practices, good consent-based practices. The funny thing is these privacy practices actually help the hacker side too, because we don't just assume that you have all the permissions. We ask you all the permissions. We do that. Um, but like, can this be used in collaboration with transportation systems for the visually impaired or blind? I guess I don't understand specifically what transportation systems means, but can it be used to help the visually blind or impaired navigate? Absolutely. Right. That's one of the I think that's one of the most straightforward use cases of augmented reality we have is getting someone from point A to B in a way that not just is better than GPS, right? Understands that like, hey, somebody dropped a crate, or there's a box in your way, you're gonna have to walk around it, right? Like complex navigation in, hey, there's a step, you have to step down in a in like the real world. It's much more complex than just follow the line. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Last time I
Yeah.
worked on maps, that state of the art was just trying to get you to the front door of the building because that information was not even in the database. All they knew was the GPS at the center of the building, and that wasn't that useful. But knowing how to get to the front door, and again, whether there's steps nowadays, Maps will tell you the elevations, so you'll know if there's hills that have to be traversed on a particular path. Maybe you could even optimize for flat terrain. So if you're in a mobility device, you don't have to necessarily go up and down the hills. There's all sorts of great things that can be known if the world models are rich enough and the routing systems are rich enough to get you in the right direction. And then there's that last contextual awareness part that the cameras and the audio can help you with. And there's a safety component too of don't cross the street. On the hacker issue, I was going to point people at a really interesting project done by Pico. Um, and Pico makes VR headsets, and maybe they'll have other devices in the future. I don't know. But they have this thing called Secure MR, and their approach to handling hacking threats is to say that all you can do anything you want in that you could normally do with computer vision libraries, but it happens within a security sandbox. And so all of the processing happens within this security boundary, the access to the microphones, the access to the cameras, and it's never allowed to leave that security sandbox. So you essentially write your program that says, here's how I identify a face, or here's how I identify eggs in a pan, or whatever you need to do with your computer vision. And that's all built into your program, but the program lives within the secure boundary. And then hackers, no matter what they do, if it works, cannot send that information out to the cloud. And that addresses the same issue that browsers have tried to address for years. Now, browsers have never done it perfectly. ActiveX notably made browsers extremely vulnerable. And today we have things called web bugs where companies like Google and Meta can put little tracking things on every web page and figure out where you're going across the web. So we have to be very cognizant that it's not always the lone hacker. It's the people who are trying to figure out the complete picture of everything we do that are going to try to glean this information. And we have to make these security boundaries really both strong, but not limiting the developers from doing what the developer needs to do. Because you don't want to say to the developer, no, you can never have the camera. No, you can never have the microphone, because that limits the scenarios. What you want to say is you can have it, but the data has to be protected in a way that you can't take it and use it for other purposes.
Right. I want to share Jesse's thought, and then Steve, I'm coming to you. Jesse was sharing with us, and it's good to see you, Jesse. It's in the best interest of the industry to lead by example before the government overregulates, like the game industry did with its rating system and the ESRB. So thanks for that thought, Jesse. And then Steve, let's hear their thoughts and questions.
Yes, hello. Thanks for having
Hi.
me. I'm Steve Michos. I'm from Canada originally, but I'm living in Finland. And I'm an XR dev who focuses on disabilities, especially physical disabilities in XR. I guess I had thoughts about VR and I had thoughts about AI, but just thinking about the AI glasses, do you think that AI glasses are going to create maybe a new social class? The glasses themselves, at least in the early stages, are quite expensive. And then the kind of AI inference that needs to happen can't be happening locally. It needs to be shipped out somewhere online to get done. And those services will probably be expensive subscriptions that are volatile and, depending how much tokens they give you, or volatile in price. And do you think that this technology could be democratized with open source AI models that can run on lower end machines? So maybe the machine you reach out to is your own private server.
I think that you kind of like started to loop around right to where I was going, which is great.
Yes.
So yeah, I actually do think that like you're gonna see like a democratization of AI models, right? In general. If you aren't on the state of the art of AI models, which there's probably many of you who aren't like obsessively following it all, the locally hosted models are becoming better and better at a rate that is faster than the new models, the new frontier models are coming out. And so there's a realistic chance that we catch up. The other thing too, Steve, is like what it's one of the things, because we're doing some things on the back end with AI stuff. And one of the things you find out really quick is the frontier models are the Swiss Army knife of AI, right? They do everything. You could sit there and go, "Hey, Claude, hey Claude, we'll pick on it. Fable, do this. And it can do it because it can do everything. But
Yeah.
there is a realistic version of a much smaller, much more purpose-built model that runs locally. That's intent is it like you can't ask it, hey, can you write me a Python program that does XYZ? But you can ask it, what am I looking at? And that's
Right.
what it does. And it's like very specialized. And then we then take that model and we cook it and cook it and cook it. And so I think a lot of the future is right now we're extremely enamored with these general models because it's very easy for us to have broad applicability. And also if you're a company trying to get like $1 trillion valuation, like saying I have a bunch of purpose-built models is not so great. So
Yeah.
you're gonna see, but as the technology becomes more democratized, like you're talking about, you're going to see that. And as the devices come out, right? Like that happened for a while with cell phones, but very quickly, if there is a ubiquitous need, we find folks launching lower and lower cost devices, right? With phones, there are more phones in the world than there are computers. And so, yes, for a small amount of time, I do think you're kind of right, where they'll be like, yeah, there'll be some people where they have this augmented technology and they have a different class and they're able to interact with the world having a disability in a way that those folks who are not in the right country, not with the right healthcare plan, not with the right access to technology
Mhm.
can't. But I do
That's
think
what I
that's
worry
a
about is
temper
financial accessibility as well.
right, but I do think that's a temporary state of the world because we've figured out miniaturized electronics at scale, at cost, to the point where
Mhm.
we build entire infrastructures around low-powered Android devices, right? Like that's a
Right.
that's a realistic platform to target. And in fact, in video games, the largest emerging market right now is this ultra low power devices that you see in South Asia, right? And
Right.
so that's like if you make games that can run on those, and so they're actually pushing this is like video game meta stuff, but they're actually pushing people to be like, do less with your video games, so that way it can run on this class of device, and then you have access to an entire different part of the world.
It's
And
all
that's
go
a
back to
purely
Oregon
financial.
Trail.
I know, well, that's a purely financial incentive. There's no regulation there. No one's twisting our arm to do it. That's them saying like, listen, you're not going to get people to get off Roblox. You need to figure out how to make these things for emerging markets. And so I think to your point, this is temporary, and I do see the local models growing. Also, just because people don't want to pay $100 to Anthropic or OpenAI, right? And you're like, oh, I
Yeah.
pay $500 once and I can run an open source model or a specialized model. Incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or it just comes with the phone. I think just to add on that, you're absolutely right. This idea of the billion or trillion parameter model is mostly a lot of hype. It does work for 80% of what you need, but it is, it's an attempt to build a moat so that only they can do it and nobody else can, and it will ultimately be democratized. One of the things you'll see is the telephony companies will have public infrastructure in the future. They call it edge computing, which is confusing because your PC at home is also edge, but it's shared computing. If you think about it, if I'm standing on the street corner in San Francisco, the model for that street corner doesn't need to know about Taipei. It doesn't need to know about the whole world. It needs to know about that street corner, what restaurants are within a block on that street corner. So if you had a local model, well, all that you would need to do is either have a computer nearby sitting in a cell phone tower that only knows about its neighborhood, or a small enough model that it could be downloaded to run on my local device, like my glasses or my phone. And the model small enough that it's downloaded in milliseconds and it just answers the queries that I might have. And you wouldn't want that model to be able to give me relationship advice. You wouldn't want that model to handle things that were personal. You'd only want it to be an expert about the location. And so that's the place we go. Just think about taking these giant models, just breaking them up into lots of little models that are experts about smaller areas. And then you just need an orchestrator that can get you the right model at the right time. That's all going to run locally on the devices. And then to the point about the money, though, I think that it's a whole other discussion, but we've made this trade-off, at least in the US, a lot, saying the ad-driven model is the way to go because it's, quote, free. That then it's accessible and everybody financially accessible. Everybody can use stuff because it's subsidized and free. But if you actually do the math, and I don't necessarily want to get into all the details, but if you actually do the math, we pay more for that model through the prices that we pay when we purchase things, the products that we buy, we're paying a much higher tax than we would if we were simply to pay the company directly for the service. So we might, need to pay $50 a month for some subscriptions to some AI or the world models or all the stuff we're talking about. But if we can save a couple $100 on our groceries because because it's less advertising overall, we're actually winning. And people who are most sensitive to financial issues are going to gain the most because it's a very regressive tax on the things they buy the most. So the ad model is not a panacea for making it accessible financially. It actually hurts more than it helps overall.
I agree. And Stephanie, if it's okay, I had a different sort of line of questioning related to VR, if that's all
Sure.
right. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So
And I would add,
I'm
I would add, Steve,
yeah.
Steve, the one thing I'd add is that just take a look at the spectacles glasses. They're just a good, right now,
Mm,
model for what's coming, right? With what they're about to come out with, because they've got two Snapdragon chips on their headset. It's all their computers right here in their glasses. It's really expensive,
mm,
but if they can do it, that's just going to get smaller and smaller. You're not going to have to offload a lot of processing. And then it does become a battery challenge overall from that device image side, right? So just something to think about.
totally.
All right,
Yeah.
moving on, Steve. Sure.
Yeah. So with respect to VR, this is probably more in your wheelhouse, Andrew. So with the anticipated Steam frame coming soon, question marks. I'm currently in development of what I'm trying to create an accessible overlay system that can be run in Steam VR that basically will allow people who don't have hands or arms to be able to do all the functionality in Steam VR with just their eyes or their gaze. And um, please excuse me for getting emotional. The inspiration behind this project was for my father-in-law, and I was basically treating him as my target because he was quadriplegic, and unfortunately, less than a month ago, he left us. And so I guess I just thank you. I guess I just don't really know where my options are, especially here in Europe, for finding other people who I can try to accommodate. It seems like you've worked with quite a few groups, at least with where you're at, in terms of being able to find people who can give the feedback that I require.
Yeah,
Excuse me.
Okay. So yeah, of course. So a few notes on there. One, okay, so let's start with just like the point blank question, which is like how do you find testers for this, right? And I think there's a bunch of different levers you can pull. We are a big enough company that we used to ask for volunteers. We stopped doing that because we wanted people to get paid for their time. So we went out.
I wish
and we
I could do that.
Yeah. I mean, but I think. But what I was gonna say is, you go out and find these companies. There's like Lighthouse, I think, is one of them. There were a few others we know. Jasmine Cano at our company, and Peter, who's I think on this call, actually know best. But you can actually ask for volunteers, right? When you're smaller, it's less it feels less exploitive if you're just like you and you're making this thing. I think the VR subreddits are actually a good place to start. You get a lot of very focused people. I think that social media tends to be pretty decent. You're in Europe, and if you feel like schlepping out to Gamescom, you can find a lot of folks in the community. And then what you do is you kind of branch out from there. And so we find folks really quickly. To be like point blank honest, it's tough to find accessibility testers at like straight gaming channels because the devices are so inaccessible by default that you kind of have to find somebody who has a friend that's interested.
It's the premise of my software is to open the door to these people because they're not welcome, basically.
Well, and so what you do is you go and find people who are interested, and you find the friend that has a headset that is willing to get their friend who's, quadriplegic over, or like we worked with Steve Saylor, who's a great advocate, and we we paid him, but he also has connections to the community. So you can like use these folks and use the accessibility community. And there's a games accessibility community, a games accessibility Discord, and go on there and just be like, hey, I'm building this overlay. I'm by my like I'm a team of one, right? I don't have money to pay people, but if people want to, I would love for people to try it and do that. And you'd be surprised at how many you get. We just felt bad doing that because we had money to pay folks, so we were like, okay, we gotta stop, you know, relying on like community good faith and actually be like, here's some dollars for like sitting down and testing our game and running through that. But from the testing standpoint, that's what you could do. And then the other thing is honestly, and we try to do this too at Alchemy, and you could do this too, is like twist the platform's arms a little bit. Like we're really trying to do that. We're like, if you can make what you're building count as a Steam controller, then you can. Steam is actually very good at this. You can
That's what I'm
plug,
doing.
yeah. So then you're right on it, right? Which is like now you can do Steam remap and it works beautifully.
Yeah.
We we argue with Meta all the time that they should have a pose remapper so we can register accessible poses where we could be like poses and can we please allow them to remap because they're always like you need to do controller support for accessibility and we're like that's just us doing it. It's a shim where we're coming up with these things versus you providing an actual accessible
It'd be nice if you
interface.
could standardize it and then everybody
Yes.
benefits.
Yes, and
That's the whole premise is I'm trying to, pioneer.
yeah. Oh, I think we lost it. Yeah. And Steam for those who I
Yeah.
saw a question. Steam is a platform on PC that sells video games primarily. So
Steve, I
Right,
don't
and that's
know.
also my,
I can't add much to what Andrew said, but I think you're muted. Yeah. But I was just going to tell you, I have my son. I'm building assistive tech for him, and there is a huge value of having somebody very close to you
Oh,
at
sorry.
home that you can try things with, and I totally understand
Yeah.
that,
Right.
and the desire to help somebody that's so close to you is super moving.
That was the hardest part, really, is just the fact that I was so close. I had breakthroughs, and it was just a matter of time to get it up to him because he's about a 2-hour drive. And I hope he knew what I was doing for him before he left. But
well,
um,
and to your point, there's things that like the funny thing about this industry is a lot of times people just need their eyes opened. So in
yeah,
VR, almost every game is accessible to seated users, not because they thought about wheelchair, because they
yeah,
sit at a desk, right?
right,
And almost every game can be played like, and so you're like, oh, that's why it's seated because the developer sat at a desk. So a lot of times, just doing the advocacy and kind of like poking and prodding folks, they'll go like, oh, I never
yeah.
thought of that. I should have thought of that. So
It's interesting when you were mentioning that you've been, kind of uh, banging on the doors of Meta and such. Because I mean, I'd love to be able to do that with Steam, but I think one of the dilemmas I run into is right now I'm just a guy with nothing to show
yeah, you have no idea
thus
how many
far.
just a guys influence companies like Valve. You just got to make sure you get the right voice and just be like, hey, I'm working on this, and if you made these simple changes, it would be great. And
Yeah,
going through there's a accessibility, whether it's through the games accessibility side or through XR accessibility. There's a bunch of discords and stuff. You'd be surprised at who's on there and who's reading it, and they might just catch a little statement you make and go like, you know what, we should do that.
yeah. Thank you. Appreciate it.
yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Steve, for all those comments. Um, just looking back over the questions, there are a couple of good ideas there for Parking School for the Blind, et cetera. So hopefully you captured those, Steve, in the side chat. And then there was a question about the spatial audio. You're seeing this too, Andrew, right? The spatial audio suggestions helping to guide users. Does anyone see the overlap with healthcare or accessibility work in guiding attention for users with cognitive visual impairment? And then they include a link to a demo of electrical muscular simulation from
Yeah.
SIGGRAPH.
Hey, how y'all doing? That was my question, just percolating in my brain. about it's a great little demo, and they use like these tens packs that direct your head, like, oh, where's the fire extinguisher? And then points you to it. It physically moves your head to it.
Mm.
I'm not sure how many people would be willing to put that onto themselves, but if I was of limited sight, and one of our donors here at the college, the reason why he got an Apple Vision Pro was so he could watch the final college basketball games really big, and so visibility was a big part of his decisions. So I don't know. It's crazy, but I would be interested in learning more about how spatial audio and how glasses could potentially help direct a person, whether that's with mild cognitive impairment or with accessibility concerns.
The I can tell you this, the field of spatial audio has grown immensely, and so we're very good at pinpointing sound, at moving sound around folks' heads. Lots of good different ways of doing that. So yeah, I think spatial audio is the easiest one. I have done a lot of Thames demos in my days, and Thames demos, it's all good until they're like, tell us when it hurts, which is always the Thames thing, and you're always like, that's when it hurts. And so it's like, um, we might need to find something else in a lab setting, just like a light vibration outside a lab setting, like a light vibration. But I think all of those are potentially useful, and I think those are the kind of things where like once you figure out the disability case, you actually figure out a more universal case because you know, vibrating phones is a great example of something that by and large could be considered an accessibility feature, right? I don't know whether my phone is ringing, it vibrates and it blinks the light, but I know lots of people who use the light blinking on their own, and I know almost everybody uses the vibrate now, right? It's
That's
I
the UDL
yeah.
model for teaching is universal design language, where, typically something that's good for one student is probably good for everybody.
Yeah, and so I see this especially with the spatial audio and the guidance too, right? Is like I wouldn't be like if you were like, "Hey, how do I get to, Avi was talking about like turn right," and you're like, "What does that mean?" And instead pinging a sound in space, so and putting a visual and doing all that, like this kind of multimodal thing where like you're like, "Okay, I could center my head in a sound really easily. I can also see the like big sign that's now floating there." All of that is clearer than just turn right in 100 feet.
Yeah. And the assistive tech also is a good example of where it works for everybody, because who hasn't had this experience of driving, having a conversation, and then the voice navigation tells you to do something and you didn't hear it because you were talking to somebody, and using the spatial audio cues and the other cues that Andrew just talked about, you can actually put that almost in the background and follow the sound as if somebody's leading you, and have it not be cognitively loading on you in the same way that voice navigation presently is, or text navigation. So there's some real positives for everybody. And another example of, I think, where the same technology works both for assistive and everybody is if you take this idea as related, Martin, to what you were talking about. Look up the field of, and Angie, you probably experiment with this, is redirected walking. But
Yes.
the goal in the research, I think this was done by NVIDIA and other groups. The goal in the research was to answer the question of how can we let you walk for a mile in a room that's only 15 feet wide? Like you just can't. You're going to hit a wall. But what they do is by stimulating your vision, by flashing lights in your periphery, they can get your eye to move on command. And there's a interesting thing you'd know about in the talk that I gave you a link for, if you don't know it already, is when our eyes are moving, we're blind. So we're all blind all the time, not just people who are visually impaired. But whenever our eyes are saccading, you actually are not actually seeing the world. It's our brain fooling us and telling us that. So now while your eyes are saccading, you can rotate the world 10 degrees, 5 degrees, 1 degree. And so you basically get people to walk in a circle in that 15-foot room. They just walk in a circle
Yeah, I've
roughly,
seen this
and they
one.
think
Yeah.
they're walking straight forever. And it's like the
Well,
Thames thing you're talking about, but you don't have to force them. You're using an illusion trick to do the same
on
thing.
on the VR side, we could do that with non-Euclidean space. So the game Hotel Infinity is a great example of redirected walking because they just use portals. William Chur, who made it, right? So like we don't even need to do flat. Like I think that's wonderful, and that's a great way of getting people to walk in a circle. But we can also just like if you fully control the world, be like, oh, as you walk, you won't realize that you're not walking in like a normal geometry. You're walking through insane loops.
Yeah.
There is a question I really quickly want to make sure we hit, just because there's a statement that I want to make that people understand. So Jesse asked about love to talk about more about blind and low vision accessibility in XR, and we did a ton of work on this in Cosmonius High. And what I could tell you, what I want to make sure people understand is the blind side of that equation is we had to drop it. It was impossible because the operating systems that these headsets run on are inaccessible flat out to blind users. They just don't work. And we've told them how to make them work and we tried to, but because of that, they couldn't even like blind users couldn't even get in our game. So we could do low vision and there's lots of stuff they have for low vision. And maybe Apple's better. I got to play with my Vision Pro and see if they have some better stuff there. But I can tell you that like the Meta Quest, which is the most popular headset by far, if you're blind, it's just you can't get into any app. You can't open stuff. So it doesn't matter if we make the most accessible experience, we're stuck. But then on the low vision one, we have lots of blogs. If you go look up Cosmonius High, and I will write that in the chat right after I'm done babbling. But Cosmonius High, we talk a lot about the low vision work we did, and Pete, who's on this call, gave a whole talk about that. So
Yeah, and just to chime in on that, if even the design of the hardware of the headset has these implications. If you can't wear a strap for many reasons, there's some people who just have hair that makes it difficult to wear straps for some of these devices that they can't have their hair and wear the device, or the weight of the device, all those things. If you can't use it in the first place, you can't even get to a well-designed experience inside, and that happens all the time, and it's very unfortunate.
that's why I'm excited about glasses, because we finally need fewer of the straps. We have a lot of folks who have like really well done hair and they can't they put the headset on, it ruins all the look that they've put together.
Exactly.
Right. Hey, Jesse, we have just 1 or 2 minutes left, but go ahead.
Yeah, hello, this is Jesse here. I love this discussion that everybody has been having, and just wanted to briefly mention that I know I haven't played with it in probably a month or two now, but I think due to a lot of the EU regulations, a lot of platforms are starting to at least, they're far from perfect. They need a lot of work, but a lot of platforms are starting to add more blind accessibility tools in there. The Quest, I do have a Quest 3, and they have two separate things in accessibility settings now for the dashboard. One which is more geared toward the low vision user because you're using the pointer interface, and the other one, which again, I really want to see improvements on. But they are also calling, there's one called text to speech, which is the pointer one. And then the screen reader is more of like using your analog sticks and buttons on your controllers to navigate the environment. It's definitely quite a bit squirrely right now, but at least they're starting to look
I mean,
at more blind accessibility.
this not, but yeah, I agree. It's helping, but I pulled up their documentation really quick while you were talking, and even they don't say blind; they say low vision.
Yeah, no, I'm a low vision user, and like even there's still like some of the icons are so small and close
Totally.
together, and
Yeah.
it's a mess, but like I'm just glad that they're finally starting to acknowledge it, because I've been advocating for this ever since the original Oculus Rift came out, and this is a huge kind of interest of mine. And I just also put a couple links in the chat. One for the XR accessibility standards we're looking for feedback on.
Great.
The Google Doc link, and then the other one I thought I would post in there is a link to my accessibility VR accessibility playlist. Did it a while back.
Good.
If that helps people.
Excellent. Thank you, Jesse.
Yep.
Thank you, Jesse. Appreciate that. Andrew Jasmine's been on that MSF thing, so she's got it. But I just want to say thank you both, Avi and Andrew, for your comments and discussion today. Thank you all for joining us. We have definitely hit time at 2:32. This was a great discussion this afternoon. Really appreciate all of you, and good luck with all your projects. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us. Bye.